Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It's August 12th. We're only about 11 days out from college football being fully underway. And now we got the Big 12 to talk about. We got a ton of things to get to for the Big 12. I like to call it America's Conference, my favorite conference in the entire country. We'll start with storylines, much like we did yesterday with the ACC. Then we got to jump into some tiers, if you want to call them that, kind of just breaking the teams up as I see them going into the season. Then we'll get into some players to watch, go down all of the teams, give you two players to watch on either side of the ball. Always kind of a fun exercise, gets you to know just a little bit about every team in this conference. And then we'll finish it off. I'll give my superlatives, I'll give my championship pick, and frankly, I don't think there's a championship pick in this conference that is outright wrong. I can tell you that. So it's going to be awesome to break all of this down. Let's go ahead and jump into those storylines, because I think it's one of those conferences that is as up in the air as you can possibly imagine, and that's my first storyline is just how many teams can win this thing. And I think when you look at the odds, there's about 7 teams that are six teams that have odds better or equal to plus 850, with TCU being the lowest team there, and no one's better than plus 550, with Kansas State there at 550 leading the conference. No one knows who's going to win this conference. Iowa State's shortly behind that group, as well as a couple other teams, but Texas Tech can absolutely win this conference. Arizona State could repeat and win the conference. Kansas State, Iowa State was there a year ago and has a chance to repeat that as well. Utah coming in. Maybe Mike Gundy has a rabbit to pull out of the hat. I'd be a little bit surprised, but at the end of the day, you look at this conference. Last year, Arizona State was picked to finish 16th. They won the conference. So you never really know what's going to happen in the Big 12. Maybe Scott Frost puts it together at UCF in a way that I'm not expecting right now. But it's going to be awesome to watch this. I think the number sits around 10 teams that can realistically win this conference. I think 7 probably are in the upper echelon of that group, but I think there's a couple in that kind of lower tier of this conference, maybe 3rd or 4th tier, that could do some really special things this year. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Always one of those conferences that will start pretty much every year talking about Arizona State from a couple years ago, or Arizona, or maybe a UCF from this year, or something like that, talking about how this conference is all over the place. It will likely be all over the place for quite some time to come. Then we got to talk about this. Is it just Arizona State's conference now? You know, Arizona State comes off a year where they walk into the conference or pick last in the conference and then win it. Could they just dominate this conference going forward? Could they be the Oklahoma like they were not too long ago before they moved on to the SEC? It's a very rich talent pool. It's a head coach that obviously is very energetic, doesn't seem to be going anywhere or have any desires to leave that job. He's in a position where they can kind of take over this conference this year. If they go back to Dallas and get another win in the Big 12 championship, obviously it's still going to be a very, very competitive conference going forward. But everyone's going to look to Arizona State every single year going forward because that recruiting profile is only going to get a little bit better. Kenny Dillingham's understanding of all of this stuff is only going to get a little bit better. And then, obviously, at some point, you're going to have to replace Sam Leavitt, but it's probably not going to be this offseason. So you have the ability to continue forward going into 2026. You could put a stamp on this conference where I thought it might be a Utah or an Oklahoma State when all those teams started coming in. It might be Arizona State if they can win a conference for the second year in a row and really make people question who else in this conference is going to challenge them going forward. This is obviously one of the teams that wants to challenge them. Texas Tech has spent quite a bit of money this offseason to make them a Big 12 contender because going into the offseason, they just weren't really. Now, they were a team that was interesting. Maybe they could put some things together. Now they're a bona fide contender. There's no two ways about that. They have difference makers on both offensive line and defensive line that I don't think anyone else in the conference other than maybe Utah has on those lines of scrimmage. They have the ability to make some noise in this conference. There's no doubt about that. They have made no bones about the money that they've spent and the reason that they're spending them. They want to get back into the top echelon of this sport and especially this conference, and I don't know what quote-unquote delivering in this season looks like. I don't know if it's 9 wins. I don't know if it has to be a Big 12 championship and a CFP berth. That's something for the people in Lubbock to figure out. But at the end of the day, you're in a position where you have an opening here. You have a conference that is absolutely wide open. You were the ones that were by far the most aggressive in this conference to go get talent. You are on paper the most talented team in this conference. Can you go take it? That's going to be a huge topic of conversation, and the pressure is very much on with a lot of those big time recruitments that could change fairly quickly if this season does not go the Red Raiders' way. Moving on to the coaches, because I think this is the best coaches across the board of any conference in the entire country. I think this is the most interesting group of guys. You have Kenny Dillingham trying to become one of the best in the entire country. You have Rich Rod and Scott Frost returning to West Virginia and UCF respectively. You have Mike Gundy and Kyle Whittingham maybe kind of winding it down for their careers, but still very, very good coaches and absolutely guys that can do a little bit more with less. And Kyle Whittingham especially has quite a bit to work with this year. So it's going to be awesome to watch all of that unfold. Obviously, you still have guys like Sonny Dykes, who was in a national title not too long ago. You have a number of other guys that are going to be really fascinating to watch in this conference. You got Joey McGuire with all the pressure in the world on him. It's going to be awesome to see all of this unfold. Obviously, the Rich Rod and Scott Frost angles are very, very fun to talk about. I think there's just so many good coaches in this conference. Matt Campbell, Lance Leipold, Chris Kleiman up there at Kansas State. It's a really, really great coaching conference. And I think when you look at this conference, you know there's going to be close games. You know there's going to be a close finish towards the end of the season. It's probably going to come down to coaching. And there's a lot of good guys on this list. Maybe it's the more veteran guys that end up winning out. Maybe it's a guy like Kenny Dillingham that is not afraid of just about any situation and will be very aggressive in some moments where maybe some older coaches would have been a little bit more conservative. And then finally, we just talked about how close this finish is going to be. Maybe it won't be. Could someone separate in this conference? Because I think that's the ultimate question. Can one team just kind of be sitting off to the side while the other 15 fight it out to figure out who's the second team to Dallas? Or is it like last year where we go into the last week of the season having no idea who's going to Dallas and Arizona State gets a win, Iowa State gets a win, and they find their way to that game? But it's going to be interesting to watch this one unfold. I think it's one of those things where Kansas State and Arizona State are probably the two teams that I think could separate the best. Maybe Texas Tech you put in that group as well. But at the end of the day, I think it's probably going to be 16 teams fighting it out. I think there's probably going to be very little separation. I think it's going to come down to tiebreakers to decide who ends up going to Dallas, and I think it's just going to be one of those conferences where every single week you look up and there's some type of upset or there's some type of mix-up in the standings, and it gets really crazy in November. I can almost promise you that. Now, maybe one of those teams can separate and make things a little bit more clear-cut, but I still think it's going to be all the way off the charts in this season for the Big 12, where you got a lot going for yourselves. I think it's a really, really interesting conference, and one of those conferences that you look at what the ACC is this year, kind of Clemson and everyone else. Something that we talked about yesterday when we broke down the ACC, and there's an opening here for the Big 12 to possibly get two teams in here, especially if a team can separate, maybe go 11-1, 12-0 possibly, and then you have a team that comes in second in the Big 12 that goes 10-2 or goes 11-1 going into that game. Then you're in position to be the team that gets two teams into the CFP. You're in pretty good shape after that. So I think when you look at the Big 12, there's not quite as much big time stuff to talk about as some of the other conferences, but there's a lot of interesting teams. There's a lot of interesting storylines. Could Matt Campbell get back on top of this conference? Could Dave Aranda get back on top of this conference after an incredible year one and since has been a little bit teetery? Could Utah find their footing after a very weird injury-filled year one in the conference? TCU, can they find their way back to the top of this conference with Josh Hoover? And then you got Kansas, Houston, all these other teams that could throw a wrench into all of that. And we'll get into that in the next segment here. We'll talk about the kind of the tiers as I see it. And this isn't necessarily exactly how I would rank these teams, just kind of the groupings that I would put them in as we head into the season, because I think there's some top contenders. I think there's a lot of really interesting contenders, and then there's some dangerous teams that are probably on the outside looking in. But we'll talk about it all right after this, so stick with us.